Hello, and welcome to the Health GoLIVE webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Ropes and Gray. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature will be available, so feel free to send in your questions for the panelists throughout the discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, who joins us from Ropes and Gray, Kelly Combs.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion. I'm so honored today to be moderating our panel discussion about digital health deal-making by biopharma and tech, an innovation match made in heaven. I have a great group of panelists with me here today that are really at the forefront of digital health innovation deals, including Megan Baca, Deb Finnick, John Vaughn, and Chris Kirby. I'll turn it over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Megan, would you like to get started?
Sure, I'd love to. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan Baca. I'm a partner at Ropes and Gray. I am located in the heart of Silicon Valley, which is appropriate, I think, for some of the innovation that we're seeing and we'll discuss today. I have a background in computer science, but beyond that original background, I've spent about 15 years representing pharmaceutical and biotech companies in licensing and collaboration matters, in addition to doing a large array of other technology matters here in Silicon Valley. So at that sort of marriage of focuses, I now lead with Kelly and our co-leader, Christine Moundas, the Ropes and Gray Digital Health Group, where we're seeing a lot of work in this really interesting space. And while Kelly's practice is more regulatory in nature and our co-lead Christine's is more healthcare and data, my practice is really truly transactional in nature. So I work on a really wide variety of different kinds of deals that involve licensing of intellectual property, of technology, collaboration and building new tools, joint ventures, work on M&A projects. And I work across technology companies, large and small startups, life sciences companies like pharma, biotech, device, the whole array across the digital health spectrum.
Great, thanks, Megan. Chris?
Sure. So Chris Kirby, I'm general counsel at PathAI, which is an artificial intelligence machine learning company that's focused on pathology. Here, I lead our legal and compliance teams. Prior to PathAI, I worked both in an academic medical center and in a biotechnology company. So I try to bring those diverse perspectives to the transactions I work on.
Great, thanks, Chris. Deb?
Hi, everyone. My name is Deb Finnick. I work at Janssen Pharmaceuticals. I head up the Janssen Business Development Group responsible for partnership strategies, including licensing, M&A, alliance management, across a broader array of diagnostic, digital, health tech, precision medicine type partnerships. So before that, I was steep in BD oncology at Janssen, and before that in commercial groups at Pfizer.
And finally, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Vaughn. I'm lead product counsel here at Verily. At Verily, we do some of the similar things. We are engaged in machine learning and AI, as well as manufacturing medical devices, software as a medical device, and clinical studies platforms. Prior to going into digital technology, I had a long career in both biopharma and in medical devices. And so this is a fun panel for me to be involved in because I like talking about bridging the gap between both of these industries.
Great. Thanks, John. And just a few words about myself. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and in the FDA regulatory and compliance practice. My clients are pharma, medical device companies, academic medical centers, providers, tech companies from time to time, really advising on a host of regulatory issues, and also working on a lot of transactions with Megan and others on our digital health team. Before we dive into the discussion today, just a few housekeeping notes. So the panel discussion is being recorded today. To the extent you have Q&A during the panel, we would encourage you to submit those through the Q&A function on Zoom. We're happy to take questions as we go, and we've also reserved some time at the end for Q&A. So just to give you a brief overview of how we plan to proceed through the panel, we'll start with a conversation about digital health innovation, and then we'll move to a conversation about some of the mechanics of deal making and some of the notable lessons learned. We'll continue on to a discussion about bridging the gap and how to ensure that collaborations between biopharma and tech and digital health players can actually be successful. And then we'll move to a Q&A. So let's go ahead and get started with the innovation discussion. Obviously, digital health innovation has been increasing in prominence over recent years and is poised to play an absolutely critical role in the future of biopharma and in tech. Innovative technology that can help optimize drug delivery or drug discovery, facilitate clinical trials, harness real-world data, improve patient engagement, clinical decision-making, could really go on and on. But we see these categories really evolving at breakneck speed. And so I want to start off with a question really for everyone on the panel. What have been some of the most recent trends and areas of digital health innovation that you've been seeing and find most interesting? We start with Deb, please.
Sure. Yeah, quite a few, Kelly. I mean, you've rattled off a number of them, but I'll mention just a few. I mean, broadly, I think what's most exciting in the trends that I see in the deals that we make at Janssen is not just single-sourced innovation. And what do I mean by that? So supporting the use of the vast amounts of data that is available, and then combining that with other tech innovations. So that could be imaging, that could be taking advantage of omics data, whether that means genomics data, proteomics data, and basically building new definitions of disease, if you will. And that's really where precision medicine comes in. So like in oncology, for example, moving beyond defining lung cancer as a tumor type, but really getting to understand and define the disease at a very granular level and using those insights across end-to-end from discovery, clinical development, clinical operations, commercial, regulatory, go-to-market strategies, et cetera. What we've also seen, I guess, most recently working on the COVID vaccine is using modeling, the best of modeling, whether that be something that Janssen creates or finding the best partnerships to then source data and basically try to improve the clinical development of a vaccine or finding where patients are located, where they're most at risk for COVID, and basically using that to be more efficient moving forward in our clinical trials, clinical development. What I really would love to see more in terms of future trends is richer evidence data sets. We see those growing in the US, but also being able to tap into those ex-US as well will be really exciting. And then digital tools in certain disease areas are just kind of calling for innovation in neuroscience, for example, in mood, in schizophrenia, in depression, and in Alzheimer's. So I think we're going to be seeing even more trends in rare disease as we, are better able to diagnose and identify those patients most at risk. So those are just a few areas from my vantage point.
Great. Thanks, Deb. What about you, John?
So if I agree with what Deb said, and if I could add from maybe a digital health perspective, I think the trend is towards connecting the dots, right? So it's understanding as an industry how we leverage the large amounts of data that are generated both by traditional healthcare and by apps and by all the different modalities that patients and caregivers use, and generate that into actionable insights, both at a societal level, right? You see with COVID or COVID testing, and also for signaling across like society, because efforts like understanding virology, understanding when a community might be facing, let's just say, a variant of concern, right? Those are societal outcomes that you can find some data to leverage. And then I think on a personalized medicine level, taking all those data and harnessing them in a way that helps us create personalized medical outcomes for the patient, but also in ways that's consistent with the user's expectation of privacy. And so I think that there's a lot there. There's a lot of data generated every time someone engages with a healthcare provider. It's what does that tell us? What does that tell caregivers? And how can we appropriately use that to get better societal and patient-specific outcomes?
And Chris, what about you? What are you seeing?
Thanks. So just to add on that, and obviously from my perspective, we're seeing explosive growth in AI and machine learning, both in drug development and diagnostics, including importantly in internal biopharma AI ML teams, which, as we'll talk about later in kind of deal making, sometimes makes it challenging, right? You have an internal team that's working on a model. We're working on a model. How do you bake off those models? How do you make sure that they, which one is the better one when you look at intellectual property? So those are really interesting developments for me. And then also the kind of decentralized clinical trial process that obviously there's a lot of focus on. That is interesting. I think will provide a lot more access, will provide better patient finding, but now brings a lot of new players into the process. And what I'll talk about a little bit later is this question around like building an ecosystem, like a transaction ecosystem, where there's less of a one-on-one transaction and more of an evaluation of who's going to be involved in the end-to-end process and how do you deliver value to all those different stakeholders.
And Megan, I want to round out with you because being at the firm, you have a practice where you're working with a variety of different players. And what are some of the most interesting trends that you've seen lately?
Well, that is exactly it. I think the ubiquity and the variety that we're seeing is just incredible. I mean, so in terms of the parties involved, everybody from early stage investors, VC investors, private equity investors, pharma investors, other big companies, we're seeing so much interest across all types of deals and investments that we see here at Ropes & Gray. Partnerships across, every variety. I actually think this panel is a really nice little capsule of different perspectives, having sort of the pharma and more of the startup and the technology company perspectives represented here makes a lot of sense because it does show how everyone's seeing these same problems from different angles. So the variety of deals is, I think, so interesting right now. Probably one of the most interesting parts of my career, watching, one day we're working on deals involving software and algorithms, and another it's consumer wearables, and another it's data as a service or platform as a service or software as a service. We're looking at payers and providers and health IT and how we can use AI in those spaces, medical devices and electronic health records and telemedicine and all of that, especially now in this post-COVID environment with everything we've learned during the last few years. It's really just an explosion of innovation and deal making.
Great. Thanks, Megan. And so now I want to turn to you, Deb, and talk a little bit about some of the shifts you're seeing either at your company or, industry-wide in the deals that you're doing as we're seeing now greater collaboration than ever before between tech and biopharma.
Yeah, so I'll start internally because it's very interesting how, and then I'll get to the external part. But I think we're even seeing within my company, and I bet the other panelists can concur with this, there is a new way of working internally. It used to be there was always this interconnection between discovery and development, but I see it even more so now with the onset of the digital age. And really what that means is the end-to-end view of the pipeline and where technology can be really enacted and impacting causes many functions to kind of have to work side by side together. So the clinical development leader, the clinical ops person, the BD person, the data science person, it's no more like a handoff. It's really working end to end on how could we look at the disease differently using the latest innovation, and how could we really impact the functions end to end. And it often requires more of a bench to bench approach, which I think is only going to get more and more acute as we move forward. And really what that, even externally now, moving to the external view, we're looking to generate value end to end across the enterprise. And oftentimes when we get a partner at the table, they're often focused on the technology, rightfully so. But I think it takes the meeting of both parties to come together and say, maybe not leading with the technology first, let's lead with what is the the business need, if you will, and then how could that be leveraged across the enterprise? And I think oftentimes when we meet with startups or digital companies that that come to us with the technology, we often kind of start with how could 1 + 1 = 3 when it comes to the way we've done things in life sciences. We want to evolve, we want to change, we want to leverage that technology, but it's often not technology first. It's often what is the business need, and then how could that technology be leveraged end to end. And it's really for us a lot about increasing efficiencies. How could we be better? How could we be faster? How could we provide more value to patients using the innovation? So it's also driving value for the partner, because they have their own business model and they're trying to grow and they're trying to get funding and capital, and how can we kind of help them build while at the same time providing value for us. And at the same time, it's a balance of, and I think John alluded to this earlier, how do we protect the patient privacy information and the use of de-identified data, which is so critical to this question of how do we tap into innovation, given there's a huge amount of data and we're trying to compute it and leverage it, but we also have to be respectful of the data source itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Deb, I mean, you mentioned so many different roles and issues at play. I mean, I think we found personally that we just need extensive teams, not just of lawyers, right? But of all sorts of people to to make sure that we're spotting issues appropriately and that we're carrying those through, the entirety of the deal. So building on to what Deb said, I want to open this up to the other panelists and talk about some notable deals that we've actually seen in recent months that help illustrate these shifts that we're seeing in industry. John, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think one really interesting transaction was last year with the acquisition by 23andMe of Lemonade Health. I think that's a really interesting story about how you have a company that did one thing pretty well, moving into other spaces, right? And so, right, 23andMe was mostly famous for sort of, ancestry and basic genetic testing, moved into some other areas of personalized medicine, and with their acquisition of Lemonade Health, moved into telemedicine, right? And so that's just a really interesting way that some of these companies started out doing one thing, but are trying to do many different things. And that's really interesting. And it's also fraught with risk. And I think the other thing, which Deb alluded to just a moment ago, is you're seeing a lot of partnerships between sort of like, major biopharma companies and tech companies trying to figure out how they can leverage things like digital biomarkers or generate real-world evidence or longitudinal data in new ways that help them see around corners a little bit more quickly.
Thanks, John. What about you, Megan?
So, I've spent a lot of time working on sort of classic life sciences, pharma, biotech collaboration, where you have a product deal or a platform deal where you have, a partnership over time to develop and commercialize products. So one thing I'm just really excited to see is how folks are adding kind of a layer to the beginning of that pipeline process that I think is really going to expedite the whole drug discovery machine. And that means faster, cheaper, better. And that's happening through a lot of the AI and machine learning drug discovery companies. So I'm excited because I'm working on a number of them now, and I'm watching the headlines and seeing big companies, Sanofi and Roche, and Genentech and Zealand and Biopharma and others partnering with smaller and in some cases somewhat unproven companies that's going to basically start the track record of these smaller companies that are getting footing and putting themselves out there, providing this early stage virtual drug discovery technology that I have strong hopes will then really explode the pipeline, which has been a struggle, I think, for pharma to fill their pipeline in past years for various reasons, and cost being one of them, and just the pace of things. So I'm really excited about watching all that, and I'm excited to see what that effect that has in the coming decade or so in terms of the overall pharma pipeline of innovative therapeutics.
What about you, Chris?
So just to add probably a little bit to what John said earlier, is that what I'm looking for in our space that I think is really interesting is that how are groups like mine, like how are they creating that ecosystem? How are they connecting with others? So obviously the Sanofi Alcon deal was a major deal in our group, in our industry, to see an early stage drug discovery or diagnostic discovery. And then also seeing a company like Tempus going after Highline. So moving into trying to figure out how to partner with or acquire CRO companies is a really interesting development as well.
And then finally, Deb, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm seeing a lot more AI discovery, as Megan alluded to, but it's interesting. For us, the real differentiation for us is the biology and the chemistry, right? And I alluded earlier, it's not just applying a platform to come up with the better target, the better molecule, the better drug candidate. It's really being able to apply AI, machine learning, having the expertise in biology and chemistry, mapping out the genomic approaches, and I mentioned the phenotypic and the other kind of omics, where you really can get those disease insights. And it's great that it's across many different therapeutic areas. One area that's particularly interesting to me is seeing how you can kind of map out the immune system, which could help not only with future vaccine approaches, future infectious disease, immunology, but also immunotherapeutics when it comes to cancer, to come up with that better therapeutic. And then if you layer in other data sources like real world evidence, that could help both in your development and your clinical trials and your clinical trial operations. So that should be able to expedite, site selection, recruitment, which is such a need in life science companies, given how much we spend and the effort and how many years it takes. And what we also kind of learned, I guess, through the COVID experience is, these technologies can be used to kind of firm the gap up when it comes to health disparities, which I think in any therapeutic area moving forward is something that we really should be putting a lot more effort behind.
Thanks, Deb. And so before we move on to our next section of the panel, we have a couple questions in from the audience. So I want to give time to those. The first question, I'll start with you, Chris. And we talked a little bit earlier about sourcing data. Just curious about your thoughts on that process. Obviously there are middlemen out there who aggregate or license from providers who have clinical data, but is that the right approach, or what have you found in personal experience to be helpful?
Yeah, so that is obviously our business. So sourcing data is one of the key assets that we to build our company, and we look at it from a bunch of different perspectives. We will do straight purchases, just materials procurement deals, but we will also do collaborative research deals. It certainly has been a frustration of mine, the focus and amount of time it takes to negotiate like value sharing over data licensing. So it's something that I've tried to do thinking on, I know a number of us have, as to how we do pilot agreements, non-exclusive licenses, or other type of like pre-competitive sharing of data that allows us just to see if products work before we value our relative contributions of data. I would say, kind of in an academic medical center prior to this, I would say I might have a different perspective when I was there. But those for large scale licensing deals, those are really difficult to evaluate what the sharing of data was. And I thought really not the way to go about it. We are focused on, as many people on this panel, on more specialized diseases or other kind of focus areas within diseases. So large data aggregators are usually not the place that we will look. We are looking for academic medical centers or other places where there are more specialized samples.
Great. And John, do you have any additional thoughts on that question?
I would just add to Chris's thoughts that, one way of looking at this, right, is that there are traditional, sort of middlemen who give data that are useful for industry for planning purposes, right, to understand a market, for go-to-market strategy, to understand what you're trying to do. And historically also for AI and machine learning, certain sets of data are helpful to teach the machine or the AI how to analyze or aggregate or sort through data. But I think the other trend that we need to be thinking about here is that what we're all really engaged in is taking those big insights and personalizing them for individual patients, right? And so what we all want to be careful about as we talk about these data is making sure that we are generating personalized medical insights for the individual in a way that is consistent with her expectation of privacy, right? And so there's a lot of data out there, and there are a lot of data that can tell you lots of things at a societal level, at a public health level, but also at the individual level. And the question is, what data are most useful for getting you to the best result for the patient, right? And so I think that's the best way to think about these data sources and how to use them.
Great, thanks, John. And here's one more question for you before we move on. Can you talk to us about any notable nuances you've seen in thinking about kind of digital therapeutics or other sorts of deals that involve devices, sensors, headsets, implants, as opposed to kind of a purely software play?
I could start. I don't know if Chris or Debbie wanted to discuss that, but you know, Verily manufacturers, and we partner with folks who actually have SAMDs, right? And so, you know, one of the interesting things about SAMDs is similar to, you know, introducing a new drug to market, right? You start with an indication or an opportunity, you know, in a market to talk to patients with a particular disease, and then you have to figure out whether that is working for those patients before you iterate new versions of it. And I also think one of the areas of real partnership between sort of digital and technology companies and biopharma are going to be, like I said before, digital biomarkers. So wearables, sensors that add data and real world evidence to help prove a concept or also help to signal things as you're working through clinical trials. Those are the two.
Any other thoughts on that before we move on?
No.
Okay, great. So I want to move on to the next section of our panel and talk about the actual deal making, so the nuts and bolts. And I want to start with you, Deb. What are you looking for when you're considering collaboration partners in a digital health deal?
You know, there's a number of things. First, I think first and foremost, you know, from the very first meeting, we're trying to establish a level of trust. And I would say I've been in this area for a couple of years now, and I'll tell you, sometimes you have to define by what really does not work. Oftentimes companies come to us, and again, like I said, it's all around a technology instead of spending the time up front understanding what is the business need and how can that technology be applied. So building that trust goes beyond the, oh yeah, we could do that for you. We know how to do all of that, and kind of move more towards a real understanding of what is the partner, what is the tech company trying to achieve in their business model, and how could we help add value to them, but also what is our business need and how can that technology be applied. And I think spending some time up front on that and not just jumping to the, oh yes, we could do it, let's start contracting, is time well spent. I would also say, come prepared to talk about what is the real differentiation point in the offering, because we do meet with quite a number of companies, and after a while everybody kind of starts saying that they can solve the problem, but to really point to what are the concrete examples of impact and proven success is often helpful. And we want to just continue to build on the successes. So, you know, and it very much is use case dependent. So, you know, taking that success, but then saying, how can that be applied to what Janssen needs, and try to find ways that by working with us, it can enrich their offering in the end, I think is an automatic win-win. So those are some of the examples. I would just end with, you know, I think Chris mentioned before pilots, right? And it's perfectly fine if it's more appropriate to kind of do a pilot. We want to walk before we run, so to speak, and say, how could we ensure success through a pilot before we scale more broadly? But we're always looking to scale because we are a large organization. There's many needs, but we, as I said, we kind of want to walk before we run. And the strong technical acumen, I think that goes pretty much without saying. A lot of companies are very well backed, but to really have a strong technical acumen and really understand what our needs are so that we can come together and kind of build something together, I think is really important. The last point is to align incentives, which I think is so critical. So align incentives around the deal. That includes a deal structure and deal terms that work for both parties. Sometimes we get these kind of grandiose kind of structures that don't necessarily work for the business case at hand. So I would just say that time up front to kind of put away the preconceived notions of what a deal structure has to be to fit a model and kind of look to build it together. Those would be my top line thoughts.
Thanks, Deb. And that's actually a good segue to the next question, because we do want to talk about value in the deal. And I'll start with you, Chris. Can you talk about how your companies may have adopted or adapted models to ensure value for all stakeholders in these sorts of digital health deals?
Absolutely. So I think we're doing some really innovative things at PathAI. And I think what you said, stakeholders with an S, is really important. So when, John and I in particular are doing, trying to build markets, we're trying to identify all the different players who need to help us execute on something. So for example, when we look at developing software, developing our algorithms, they're only so successful without labs actually having digital scanners in the labs. So we've been thinking about how do we work with biopharma companies on trials, how do we develop these things, but ultimately how do we get it to the end user? And so how do we reserve value or incentivize all the different parts of the chain to make sure we can acquire samples, we can get them through clinical trials, and we can get them out to the market? And that's trying to avoid like the point solutions of health tech 1.0, which I saw a lot of in my provider days, where you have a bunch of different solutions that don't work together. So that goes to the next thing we're trying to do, is to try to figure out where there also just might be complementary partnerships or co-selling arrangements in which we might partner with companies. And we've done it recently with a company called Akoya, to go to market with two different technologies, but to do it in a way that works with one another. So we make sure that our two technologies work together for the end user. We've also thought about consortium agreements or other kind of like pre-competitive arrangements. So there are some areas where the shared value is the availability of a diagnostic tool. So we've worked with a number of different pharma companies within particular disease areas to say, how can we share resources, patient data, to help develop that tool, with the ultimate output being everybody within this particular disease area can use our tool. And then the last thing we're thinking about is kind of what I would loosely call disaggregating our deliverables, which is that, for certain of our partners, there are parts of what we do that are most useful to them, and others want the full suite of services. So we've tried to be flexible to say that we have a little bit of a menu of what we're willing to do with partners.
Thanks, Chris. What about you, John?
I would say a couple of things. First is, verily, to the extent that we have customers in biopharma, for instance, we're looking for opportunities to partner with them where we are really good at a thing. We're good at machine learning or AI and developing either software or a device that we can partner with them to really add value, show what we can do, and then also make sure that it's additive to the partner. And I think the second thing that we're doing also, and you see this sort of across the industry, is a lot of companies have breadth, but we're also going for depth. So recently we acquired a company called SignalPath. Verily has a clinical studies platform that has over 500,000 patients who've signed up to take charge of their health and to get partnered with clinical trials where they meet the inclusion criteria, right? And so that was an offering that we had. Acquiring SignalPath allows us also to help run clinical studies with some of these partners in a way that reduces the level of fragmentation and also reduces the amount of time that a pharmaceutical partner might have to spend on generating those data to file for a new, an NDA or a new indication, right? And so I think one of the ways that we're trying to show value creation is that we understand where those customers are, whether it's B2B or whether it's a big biopharma company. And also, as we're learning more, we're getting better at working with these partners. So to Deb's point, folks like Chris and I want to make sure that our companies are able to explain pretty crisply to a customer what we can do, why we're better at it, and what the value proposition would be up front, so there are no surprises later.
Thanks, John. So, relatedly, when we think about commercial initiatives, digital health deals certainly have their own unique objectives and success criteria. I mean, I think patient adherence is one that comes to mind from a lot of deals that I've personally worked on over the years. What metrics and KPIs tend to come up frequently, and would you be using to track success of these initiatives over the longer term? And let me start with Chris on that one.
Yeah, so I'll start with the KPIs our company's using, and like many companies, you start with the technology that you develop, you move into clinical trials, and then ultimately to commercial. So on the first one, we've obviously worked and tried to track the scale of our training data, which is our largest asset. So that's something that we track very closely. That gives our partners confidence in the algorithms we're developing. We're looking at the number of trials using our technology, and we've really started to move into, have moved and have some exciting announcements upcoming with some large scale worldwide trials that we're working on. And that's also a kind of proxy for future patient impact. And then last, obviously, we'll be tracking the number of providers using our technology and the number of patients touched. And those are kind of, I know those are generic, but I think it's important is because with industries like ours, we're not quite sure. We have some ideas of what our ultimate commercial business model is, but I think we're somewhat flexible, whether we're going to end up being a B2B or a direct reimbursement or some mixture of those things. So we want to make sure that we're tracking like the ultimate impact of our technology on providers and patients.
Thanks, Chris. And so the next question, Megan, I'd love to throw to you, kind of given the breadth of your experience here. So, certainly this is an area fraught with risk. And just in thinking about prior deals that you've been working on, what are some of the most notable issues or lesson learned that have come out of those?
Yeah, it's really important to think about. Actually, we just got a question that relates a little bit to this, and I will mention the question without really answering the substance of the question because it's not my area. But the question had to do with how you analyze kickback risks in these deals. And I just think not being a healthcare regulatory compliance lawyer, I won't answer the question, but I will say it's a really good example of the kind of issue spotting you have to be able to do in these kinds of deals. Much more so, much wider variety of issues than you have in many other kind of more straightforward transactions, like an acquisition, of a standard non-technical, non-digital health company. So you have regulatory concerns, you have privacy concerns, you have IP concerns, both sort of soft IP, plus patents. You have a lot of different healthcare related concerns. So the plan is really to have the right team in place who can help you from a multidisciplinary perspective think through all the different issues. That wasn't really the answer to my original answer to the question, but it came up based on that question. What I do think about in terms of risk and lessons learned is that, again, these transactions are not cookie cutter, right? If you look at like a standard M&A acquisition, stock or asset acquisition, or you look at a license and collaboration agreement from 15 years ago, there's like a very, prescribed range of different options that you have in terms of how deals move forward, what happens if they terminate, what happens in sort of worst case scenario and best case scenario situations. These kind of deals are, I would say, much more bespoke, and not only looking at the different risks involved, you have to really take a close look at the players and the different eventualities of what might play out in the transaction. So we all hope that these transactions succeed wildly, but of course they don't all. And I've seen lots of situations where partners get together and they have some great plans, but because of various aspects of risk that don't align, the deals either fail to launch or they launch and they fall apart. And we spend time helping to kind of disentangle and clean up the mess. And this is, I think, particularly pronounced because we're dealing with areas with really untested technology, new startups, new ideas, new companies that all are not going to succeed. So in terms of handling it in a traditional like technology deal, you might have like a source code escrow or other kinds of springing rights that come up upon like a bankruptcy or certain kinds of termination that would help the other party get access to the technology. Those sorts of traditional protections for helping with technology enablement and allowing the partner to move ahead even if the other partner is falling apart won't necessarily work in these kinds of cases. You have to really think through the different interdependencies that are involved here. So just as one example that I've looked at recently with a company that has technology involved in sample tracking. You know, there's lots of reasons why you're shipping samples around and you need technology to track that. It's just an incredibly complex ecosystem of, you know, the sample from the patient through the hospital to wherever it's going to, and then the information going somewhere and the sample going somewhere. Tracking all that is incredibly important to the success of the company. And if the company that's hosting that technology is not doing well or is running out of money or something, how you can't just get a source code escrow for that software and be expected to be able to just turn on a light switch and take it over, right? You need to basically be able to coordinate with all the different pieces of the end-to-end solution. And then you've got regulatory concerns as well with how you would port that over and start over again. So there's just so many different lenses that you need to think about when approaching the same kinds of like what if scenarios that you deal with in any transaction. But I think a couple of things help, you know, as Deb mentioned, thinking about pilots help because it helps you kind of get your feet wet and test the technology and figure out like what are the risks here. And having the sort of exit scenario be not an afterthought is sort of like part of the whole conversation from the get-go. And then finally, just understanding there's really no cookie cutter or market solution right now, given the variety of technology and the variety of deals. There's a really big variety of solutions as well that people are coming up with to protect those sorts of eventualities.
Thanks, Megan. And I see we've got some questions coming in on the Q&A. At this point, I think we're going to save those toward the end of the discussion. I want to hit one more substantive topic before we close out today. And this is really about bridging the gap between biopharma and tech and digital health players. I mean, obviously, when we think about biopharma, kind of long history of operating in a heavily regulated environment, and those, among other differences, I think can add a layer of complexity to these sorts of collaborations. So John, I'd love to hear your thoughts about ways that we can bridge the gap between industries in order to achieve more successful partnership.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kelly. I think first to your point, success in this space, which is emphatically the future of healthcare, requires a level of virtuosity that companies traditionally haven't had to sort of think about, right? Because you need to be good at healthcare and at technology. And I think the first thing is that, you know, coming from healthcare as I do, you know, and I'm a regulatory like you are, lawyer like you are, Kelly, right? Is that you think in terms of FDA regulation, in terms of all the follow-on effects of making sure that you have a good clinical studies plan, that you are in compliance with all applicable regulations, and it takes time to bring a new drug or a new product to market in healthcare. And you saw in the pandemic, to some extent, that regulators lifted the guardrails for emergency use authorization. So you did see new therapeutics and new interventions approved in record time, but I haven't seen any indication that any regulator around the world is going to start engaging that level of rapidity in terms of approvals for most other situations in the future. And so, you know, and I think some of the traditional healthcare approaches informed by the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm, right? And then in the technology space, you have fail fast, right? And it's iterative, and you have engineers creating different codes and different versions of operating systems really, really quickly. And, you know, bridging that gap sometimes, you know, to one extent, I think companies that have been successful in health tech on the tech side have adopted quality regulations and quality systems and thinking about quality in ways that are analogous to pure play healthcare products. And there's two reasons for that. One is that that's the industry that we're working in, and these are, you know, patients and society, we want to make sure that we're generating the right data in the right way. But also it requires companies on the tech side to think carefully about what they're doing, because as we all know, as regulatory lawyers, a wearable could just be a consumer product, or it could be a medical device. And your decision trees, once you're generating a medical device that might be diagnosing or treating or managing a condition, are quite different than if it's just a watch that you're wearing to see how fast you're running, right? And on the tech side, though, I do think that we are able to show companies that through some of these digital biomarkers, like wearables that are manufactured in medical devices, through machine learning, through AI, we can actually help accelerate the timeline for getting studies completed, locking data, and generating those data. I think that's an area where the ethos in the tech industry can really help deliver interventions a lot faster than they historically have been done. So I think that that's a good way of bridging the gap, thinking about what are the strengths of each industry and making sure that we're merging those strengths. And the other thing about success in this industry is that, I came from life sciences, and I thought I knew tech until I worked here for a while. And the level of regulation in tech and the things that you need to know in order to do this well and correctly, and again, within the expectations of patients and caregivers, requires a lot of skill and a lot of thought. So I also think from the healthcare side, companies who are looking to get into the space need to think carefully about users' expectations of privacy, what they're doing with these data, how they're generating them, and then all the follow-on things that they should be thinking about when they get those data, how they should be used and how they should be interpreted.
Yeah, and just to add to that, John, I would say also, when you think about the way that health tech companies brainstorm, which is really exciting, this is one of my kind of direct first experiences within a tech company. I've tried to take that to the way we work together as lawyers. For those lawyers on the phone, is I've really tried to work to reach out to lawyers early on in the deal process, just to say hello, to say, I'm a real person, and to be kind of real that, some of these areas are really complex. I don't know how to best structure it, but I'd love to just chat with you informally about how we structure a particular transaction. And I found that to be kind of welcome and I think really helpful. And so I'll just say for myself, if I ever working with anybody on the phone here, I'd love for you to reach out to me informally and just chat and early on in the process, because, I think the speed of these deals needs to go much, much faster to make our industry better. And I'm hoping that we can play that role.
Could not agree more.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, John. So at this point, we'll move into the Q&A portion of the panel. We've got a few questions in the Q&A bar already. I would encourage you to submit more if you have them, and we'll try to answer them as we go. I also have a lot more burning questions that we've compiled for the panel and to keep us busy over the next few minutes. So one question that just came in through the Q&A is, in the pharma sector, can you please speak to how deals are done when it comes to patient protocol services, like patients who are taking medication, receiving ancillary services and tools to increase compliance and patient outcomes? So I'll just give my perspective on that briefly before seeing if anyone else has additional insights. These sorts of deals require extensive coordination with your regulatory and privacy counsel. There are almost always going to be very significant FDA implications. For example, I think in some of the more extreme cases, label updates, could be required if the digital health component is seen as necessary or even desirable to patient outcome, and worked with companies to kind of shepherd them through the FDA process there. But just generally, even when we're not talking necessarily about a companion app, when, especially if you're talking about a disease or condition that would place the tool in a high or moderate risk category, it's highly likely that there are going to be FDA implications for device clearance, just as one example, adverse event tracking, and so on. And that, of course, is in addition to all the privacy considerations. So anytime, we're talking about a tool that is specifically directed to patients and the intended use is to achieve, a specific health outcome like compliance or adherence or whatever, I think it's critical to get the FDA team engaged as soon as possible, just to think about some of those issues. I don't know if any others have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, Kelly, the only thing, and I agree with what you said, but we've been through this in a number of therapeutic areas. It really does depend on the therapeutic area. And I think you were alluding to that, right? We work with companies where together we had to navigate and iterate in a certain therapeutic area, but it doesn't mean if we signed a deal in the next therapeutic area, you could just take all of those learnings. There may be different considerations. So it's, to Megan's point earlier, it's not really cookie cutter. They're bespoke depending on what patient privacy, what the disease state is, what adverse events that you could be uncovering, and privacy, et cetera. So that's the only other thing I wanted to add. You can't just kind of carry through a certain deal or consideration from one TA to another necessarily.
Yep, that's absolutely right, Deb. I agree, depending on the therapeutic area, depending on the health outcome at issue, and actually how the tool is intending to achieve that outcome. Some other questions, just curious, and I'd be interested in everyone's thoughts on this. What sorts of digital health technology are you looking forward to seeing to go to market in the coming years? Deb, I'll start with you.
So one thing I think we haven't talked about a lot are algorithms that could be created in partnership with tech companies and life science companies. And those algorithms, it always starts with the best data sources. It starts with having the right kind of platform to generate that algorithm. But it could be applied for R&D purposes, but I think also very interestingly will be the future deployment of those algorithms in the marketplace. And there's a lot to consider there. What could be the best, the partner you may have for R&D purposes might not be the partner you have for commercial purposes when it comes to deploying that algorithm. So it could be a multi-partnership approach. And so that is complex enough to have to navigate from start to finish with multiple companies. So I think just applying an algorithm to increase diagnosis of a certain disease state, or an area where it may take a very long time for patients to get adequately diagnosed, and by then the disease has progressed to a point where their quality of life will greatly be impacted. So that's one area. And I alluded to health disparities, but I do think we could be doing a lot more across the board in terms of health disparities in general. So those would be two areas I would comment on.
Great, thanks. John, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think one area that's going to be really interesting to see is, like Deb said, with algorithms, technology has progressed to a point where we can catch diseases very early, or we can see where a patient might progress to a disease. And the regulatory landscape for getting those sorts of devices cleared is complex, but we're going to get there. And I'm very interested to see how we can do that in ways that prevent disease instead of just cure or treat diseases. And I think we're actually very close in a number of different, disease states to getting to that. And I think that's really exciting because it will, prevent people from having to go through treatment to certain respects if we do this well as an industry.
Thanks, John and Deb. Anything in particular that keeps you all up at night when you're working on these sorts of deals? Megan, let me start with you.
Yeah, it's just the complexity of it and the fact that it's untested and there's no known path. It also keeps me up at night because it's very exciting. It's so great to have all these new pathways for discovery and innovation and partnership. So I really do think it's worth all of the attention that we're giving this. It's worth all the investment that we're giving this. And honestly, I think healthcare in the future will look back and think about healthcare before technology as sort of the dark ages of healthcare. It's going to be very, very exciting.
Yeah. Chris, what about you?
So for me, probably two things. One is just the uncertainty and change in state privacy laws. So there was a lot of challenge with HIPAA or certain ex-US privacy laws, but the explosion of individual jurisdictions changing and creating different privacy structures, I think is just going to be hard for about those of us who deal in data as to how we create products that ultimately we hope are worldwide products. And then, I think just to add, obviously, our business is algorithms. So I appreciate the other panelists mentioning it. The question of whether we'll actually get providers to use it in their workflow and how they will do it in their workflow is still an interesting question for us. I think I think best-in-class technology that works, but actually getting a pathologist to put it in their workflow and change the way they do things or the way they've done things for decades, I think will be a really exciting, but a really challenging change management part of what we're doing.
Great. Thanks, Chris. We probably have time just for one more question. And the question is, how or when do you push collaboration among product teams to lay out a longer term roadmap for new features that may add risks or value, or markets that involve different regulatory regimes? This is something that I have quite a bit of experience with, because oftentimes when we're engaged to do FDA related diligence on a deal, the technology as it currently exists or may be marketed doesn't in fact trigger FDA requirements, may not yet constitute software as a medical device. But over the longer term, the next generation of the product may be headed in that direction. And I certainly think it's important that, to the extent that longer term objective is critical to valuation of the deal, we need to understand that right away, because we need to understand that, kind of the right steps have been taken from a regulatory perspective with respect to, for example, consenting subjects, ensuring that data are held for inspection or submission to FDA. Things that, if not done or at least contemplated at the early stages, can really frustrate the regulatory objectives down the road. I don't know if others have additional thoughts on that one.
I think it is very important to be looking at this forward-looking planning for a lot of the risk reasons I mentioned as well, that it's all well and good when a company comes to you with exciting technology, but as Deb mentioned, you really need to be looking at what the actual business need is, and not just now, but over the course of years. And so, how does a product team plan to support something and develop it over time? And are there any problematic twists and turns? And what's the budget for that? And where's the money going to come from? And all of those questions are super important. So in terms of the how and the when to push, I think it's early and often. I think it has to be from the top as part of the overarching deal structuring, partnership, risk management, evaluation process through and through. If you're going to be partnering this technology with another company that's trusting you and relying on you to continue to support it.
Great, thanks, Megan. And unfortunately, we're out of time today. I'm sure we could have spent a lot more time with all of you. Thanks so much to all the panelists for your great insights today. A recording will be circulated from the program, and we would certainly welcome additional questions or reactions for anyone who was able to participate today. Ropes and Gray regularly presents and publishes on all sorts of digital health topics. If you would like to receive updates on what we're doing, please email rgevents@ropesgray.com. And with that, I'll turn it over to Health for any final remarks. Thanks all.
Thank you to Kelly and all of our panelists. Please visit our website at hlth.com to catch up on all Health GoLIVE webinars. And join us at the inaugural Vive event, the industry's new health information technology event, coming to Miami Beach, March 6th through 9th, 2022.